Alpha, strip her mark. The king's voice was as cold as the silver blade at my throat. I couldn't scream, not because I was afraid, but because he had taken my voice years ago. My name is Elara, the mute lunar of the Shadow Crest Pack. For 3 years, I have lived as a ghost in my own palace, serving an alpha king whose cruelty knows no bounds. But as the ritual blade touched my skin, the heavy iron doors of the throne room didn't just open, they were torn from their hinges. A man stood in the wreckage, covered in the scars of 1,000 battles and smelling of blood and ancient magic. This wasn't a soldier. This was Kaelen, the forgotten wolf the king had exiled to the Dead Lands a decade ago. Kaelen locked eyes with me, his own glowing a primal, forbidden blue. He didn't look at the king. He looked at the empty throne beside me and growled a single promise. "I've come to take back what you stole." The air in the room turned to ice as Kaelen stepped over the shattered wood. King Valerius sneered, signaling his elite guards to strike, but they hesitated. There was something about Kaelen's scent, a royal authority that felt older than the kingdom itself. To the pack, I am just a broken Luna, a symbol of Valerius's total control. They think my silence is a curse, but they don't know my hidden identity. I am a siren wolf, the last of a bloodline that can command any alpha with a single word. My silence isn't a weakness, it's a cage I built to keep the world from burning. If I speak, the truth of what Valerius did to my father will be revealed, and Kaelen, the man I once loved in secret, will realize I'm the reason he was exiled. As Kaelen draws a jagged black blade, I realize the rebellion hasn't just started. It's a collision of secrets that have been buried for 10 years. If you're ready to see if a silent queen can topple a tyrant, hit that subscribe button and join the pack. Also, let us know in the comments what time it is and what city or country are you watching from today. The heavy scent of ozone and ancient magic lingered in the air as Kaelen took a final step toward the dais. The High Council sat in stunned silence, their eyes darting between the exiled wolf and the tyrant king who still held a trembling hand over my shoulder. Valerius tried to maintain his composure, shouting for the backup guards, but Kaelen simply raised his hand. With a flick of his wrist, a wave of pure kinetic force sent the remaining soldiers sprawling against the stone pillars. This was the moment everyone had waited for. Valerius, seeing his power crumble, stumbled backward and tripped over the hem of his own ceremonial robes. He fell from the throne, his crown skittering across the floor like a worthless toy. Kaelen reached out and caught me before I could fall with him, pulling me into the safety of his shadow. The council began to stand, one by one, lowering their heads in a gesture of absolute surrender. It felt like the nightmare was finally over. The palace was quiet, the king was defeated, and the man I loved was standing right beside me. But the relief was short-lived. As Kaelen looked down at me, his eyes searched mine for the recognition he craved. He whispered that we could finally leave the secrets behind. He asked me to say his name, to use the voice he believed was stolen by a curse. He didn't know that my silence was the only thing keeping his true lineage a secret from the gods themselves. If I spoke, the mark on his soul would ignite, alerting every hunter in the 5 kingdoms to his location. The doors at the back of the hall didn't just open, they dissolved into black mist. Valerius stood up from the floor, blood trickling from his lip, but he was laughing. He pointed a shaking finger at the shadow-clad figures emerging from the mist, the Void Walkers. He revealed that he had known Kaelen would return and had traded half the pack's souls to the underworld for an army that couldn't be killed by silver or strength. Kaelen tightened his grip on his blade, realizing the victory he thought he had won was nothing more than a carefully laid trap. We weren't the new rulers of the Shadow Crest Pack. We were prisoners in a room filled with ghosts. Valerius stepped back onto his dais, his eyes burning with a dark, unnatural light, and told us that the real coronation was only just beginning. The Void Walkers moved with a sickening, fluid grace, their forms flickering like dying candles in the wind. Kaelen pushed me behind the massive marble throne, his body tensing as he prepared to face an enemy that didn't bleed. He called out to the High Council, demanding they stand and fight for their true bloodline, but the elders remained frozen, their spirits already suppressed by the dark mist filling the room. Valerius watched from the balcony, a puppet master enjoying the chaos he had unleashed. Every time Kaelen's blade passed through a Void Walker, the creature simply reformed, its cold fingers reaching for his throat. I watched as the man who had survived the dead lands began to tire, his movements slowing under the weight of an impossible battle. My heart screamed for him, but my lips remained sealed. I knew that if I uttered a single syllable, the siren's call would banish the shadows, but it would also mark Kaelen with a glowing sigil that the gods used to track the starborn. I was watching him die to keep him hidden. In a desperate surge of strength, Kaelen managed to drive his blade into the floor, creating a shockwave of blue light that momentarily drove the mist back. He grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the narrow service tunnel behind the tapestry. We sprinted through the damp, dark corridors, the sounds of the Void Walker's shrieks fatting behind us. We burst out into the moonlit gardens at the edge of the cliffs, the cool air hitting our lungs like a miracle. We had escaped the throne room. We were alive. Kaelen stopped at the edge of the precipice, looking back at the glowing windows of the palace. He told me that we would gather the exiled warriors from the forest and return to finish Valerius once and for all. He believed we had found a momentary sanctuary in the wilderness. He looked at me with a soft, tired smile, believing that for the first time in a decade, we were finally free of the king's reach. But as the wind shifted, the flowers in the garden began to wilt and turn black. The ground beneath our feet didn't feel like soil anymore. It felt like hollow wood. Valerius's voice echoed from the very trees surrounding us, revealing that the gardens were never part of the palace grounds. We hadn't escaped into the forest. We had run directly into the mirror realm, a pocket dimension designed to trap the mind. The victory of our escape was a total illusion. We were standing in a cage made of our own memories, and the exit had vanished the moment we stepped through. The walls of the mirror realm pulsed with a rhythmic, heartbeat-like thud, making the air feel thick and suffocating. Kaelen slashed at the phantom trees, but his blade passed through them as if they were made of smoke. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a rare flash of panic, realizing that his physical strength meant nothing in a world built on lies. He began to shout my name, begging me to look at him, to stay grounded in reality before the illusion consumed us both. I could see the memories shifting in the mist around us, visions of our childhood before the king's greed destroyed everything. I saw a younger Kaelen laughing under a summer sun, and a version of myself who still had a voice to sing with. It was tempting to step into those memories and stay there forever. Kaelen reached for me, but his hand started to turn translucent. He told me that if we didn't find the anchor of this realm soon, we would become permanent fixtures in Valerius's collection of lost souls. I realized then that the king wasn't just trying to kill us. He was trying to harvest the very essence of our bond. I stepped toward Kaelen, ignoring the screaming phantoms that wore the faces of our fallen friends. I placed my hand over his heart, feeling the steady drum of a starborn warrior. I didn't need a voice to communicate the truth. I poured my focus into the mental link we had shared as children, showing him the one flaw in the mirror. In the distance, a single object didn't shimmer like the rest. The silver ritual blade Valerius had used back in the throne room. It was the only physical object that had crossed over with us. Kaelen understood instantly. He lunged toward the blade, ignoring the thorns of shadow that tore at his skin. He grabbed the hilt and drove it into the center of the blackened garden. The world shattered like glass, the sound of 1,000 mirrors breaking at once filling our ears. We collapsed onto a cold stone floor, gasping for air. The mist was gone, and we were back in the palace, but not the throne room. We were in the lower dungeons, surrounded by the iron bars of the high-security cells. We had broken the illusion, and for a second it felt like a triumph. We were out of the king's head and back in the real world, standing over the broken remains of the ritual blade. But as the dust settled, we heard the sound of heavy boots. The victory of returning to reality was bitter. We had broken out of a mental prison only to find ourselves in a physical one. Valerius was standing on the other side of the bars, flanked by his Void Walkers. He told us that he had moved us while we were dreaming. He looked at Kaelen and revealed the ultimate price of our escape. The ritual blade was the only key to the palace gates, and by shattering it, we had locked ourselves in the deepest grave in the kingdom. The dampness of the dungeon walls seeped into our bones as the heavy iron gate hissed shut. Kaelen threw himself against the bars, his muscles straining until the veins in his neck stood out, but the metal had been tempered in dragon fire and wouldn't budge. Valerius stood just inches away, his face twisted in a mask of triumph. He told Kaelen that the forgotten wolf was finally where he belonged, buried in the dirt, far away from the throne he craved. Kaelen slumped against the wall, his chest heaving. He looked at me and apologized, whispering that he had led me into a dead end. He believed that his strength had failed us and that the rebellion had died in the cell. It was the lowest point we had ever reached. To the king, we were already ghosts. Valerius turned his back on us, walking away toward the stairs, laughing about how he would announce our accidental deaths to the pack by morning. This was the moment of our greatest defeat, but it was also the moment the king's arrogance blinded him. As the sound of the king's footsteps faded, I felt a familiar heat rising in my throat. I reached out and grabbed Kaelen's hand, pressing it against my neck. I needed him to feel the vibration, the sudden pulse of energy that was finally breaking through the mute curse. I wasn't silent because of Valerius. I was silent because the power inside me needed time to mature. The mute Luna was a cocoon, and the siren was finally ready to emerge. I looked at the lock on the gate, focusing every ounce of my will on the tumblers. I didn't scream and I didn't shout. I simply opened my mouth and let out a single, low-frequency hum that only a wolf could hear. The sound didn't travel through the air. It traveled through the stone. I watched as the iron bars began to glow with a pale blue light. The lock didn't break, it dissolved. Kaelen stared at me, his mouth agape. He realized in that instant that I had never been his victim to save. I was his equal in power. The cell door swung open with a soft groan. We had done the impossible. We were out of the cages, and the king had no idea that his silent prize was now the most dangerous predator in the palace. We stepped out into the hallway, moving like shadows toward the upper levels. We weren't running away anymore. We were hunting. Moving through the dark corridors of the lower palace, Kaelen followed my lead, his eyes fixed on me with a newfound intensity. He told me that for years, he had imagined the sound of my voice, but he never imagined it would have the power to dismantle mountain-tempered iron. We reached the base of the great spiral, the staircase that led directly to the king's private chambers. Kaelen drew his blade, whispering that the guards would be thinner here because Valerius believed we were still rotting in the pit. We ascended in total silence, our footsteps muffled by the thick crimson carpets. At the top of the stairs, we found the entrance to the royal armory. Kaelen signaled for me to wait as he slipped inside, returning moments later with a breastplate of ancient silver. He told me that if we donned the armor of the royal guard, we could walk straight through the main hall to the throne. He believed this disguise was our ultimate victory, a way to get close enough to Valerius to end the reign without shedding a drop of unnecessary blood. We marched past the sentries, our faces hidden behind the steel visors. The guards nodded to us, assuming we were just another patrol checking the perimeter. We reached the heavy oak doors of the throne room, and Kaelen leaned in, his voice barely a breath. He said that once we entered, he would challenge the king to a duel of honor, forcing Valerius to fight him in front of the pack. He believed that even with the Void Walkers, the king wouldn't dare refuse a formal challenge in the presence of the High Council. But as we pushed the doors open, we didn't find a room full of witnesses. The throne room was empty, save for a single candle flickering on the altar. Valerius's voice boomed from the rafters, revealing that he had known about our disguise the moment we stepped into the armory. He laughed, telling us that the armor we were wearing wasn't silver at all. It was magnetized lead. Suddenly, a massive hum filled the room, and the armor began to pull us toward the floor with the force of 1,000 anchors. Kaelen crashed to his knees, unable to lift his sword, and I felt my own limbs becoming heavy as stones. The victory of our disguise had been a calculated move by the king to immobilize us without a fight. Valerius stepped out from behind a pillar, holding a remote crystal that pulsed with the same magnetic energy. He told us that we had walked right into his workshop, and now he didn't even need guards to finish us. The pressure of the magnetized armor was unbearable, pinning Kaelen's shoulders to the cold floor and crushing the air from my lungs. Valerius walked a slow circle around us, tapping the glowing crystal in his hand, mocking the forgotten prince for falling for a trick as old as the kingdom itself. He told the room that strength was nothing without the intelligence to use it, and that Kaelen had always been too impulsive to lead. He leaned over me, his breath hot against my visor, and whispered that once Kaelen was dead, he would find a way to make my silent power serve him forever. Kaelen grunted, his fingers clawing at the stone floor as he tried to find leverage. He told the king that he might have trapped his body, but he hadn't broken his spirit. He looked at me, his eyes burning with a desperate intensity, and told me that this was the end of the line. He believed that our only option was for me to use the siren's call to shatter the crystal, even if it meant the gods would find us. He was ready to sacrifice his freedom for one last chance at the king's throat. But I saw what Kaelen didn't. The magnets were powered by the very armor we wore, creating a closed loop of energy. I didn't need to scream, I just needed to change the frequency of the metal. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched the chest plate of Kaelen's armor. Instead of a hum of power, I let out a sharp, percussive click from the back of my throat, a sound that resonated deep within the molecular structure of the lead. The magnetization didn't just stop, it reversed. The armor suddenly repelled the floor with such violence that Kaelen and I were launched upward, flying toward the vaulted ceiling. Valerius gasped, his crystal flickering and then exploding in his hand as the feedback loop shattered his control. We crashed into the high stone balcony, far above the king's reach, and shed the heavy plates of metal as they began to melt. We stood on the ledge, looking down at the bewildered tyrant. Kaelen grabbed a decorative spear from the wall, his face set in a mask of grim determination. He told me that we finally had the high ground and that Valerius was out of tricks. We had turned his own trap into a catapult that put us exactly where we needed to be, at the entrance to the Royal Sanctum, where the true crown was kept. For the first time, it looked like the king was truly afraid. Kaelen and I didn't waste a second, sprinting through the golden archway of the Royal Sanctum. This was the heart of the palace, a room filled with the relics of 1,000 years of wolf history. At the center sat the true crown, a circlet of white gold that pulsed with a soft, lunar light. Kaelen reached for it, his hands shaking with the weight of his family's legacy. He told me that once the crown touched his brow, the pack's blood bond would shift to him automatically, and the Void Walkers would dissolve into nothingness. He believed this was the final piece of the puzzle, the ultimate victory that would end the bloodshed without another strike. He lifted the crown, and for a moment, the room was bathed in a brilliant, pure radiance. The heavy pressure of Valerius's dark magic seemed to evaporate, and the distant sounds of fighting in the courtyard ceased. Kaelen turned to me, the crown resting on his head, and his eyes were clear and bright. He told me that we had won. He claimed that the nightmare was finally over and that he could feel the strength of the ancestors flowing through him. For the first time in 10 years, he looked like a king who was at peace. But the silence that followed wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a void. I looked at the shadows in the corner of the room and saw them beginning to stretch and grow, even under the light of the crown. Valerius stepped into the room, looking tired but strangely satisfied. He told Kaelen that the true crown hadn't been charged with lunar energy in a century. He revealed that the light we saw was actually a siphon, designed to drain the life force of any unauthorized wolf who tried to claim the throne. Kaelen's knees buckled as the crown began to glow a deep, sickly violet. He tried to pull it off, but it was fused to his skin. The victory of reclaiming his birthright had been the deadliest trap of all. Valerius explained that he had let us reach the sanctum because he needed a starborn's soul to fully activate the crown's dormant powers. I realized that by helping Kaelen reach the throne, I had unknowingly assisted in his execution. Valerius stepped forward to finish the ritual, believing that with Kaelen's strength added to his own, no voice in the world could ever stop him. Kaelen's face turned ashen as the violet light of the crown pulsed harder, drawing the very life from his veins. He gasped, telling me to run, to save myself before the siphon consumed everything in the room. He believed that his death was inevitable and that the bloodline of the Starborn was about to be extinguished forever. Valerius laughed, stepping closer to watch the light fade from Kaelen's eyes, boasting that he had finally won. He told the empty room that once the crown was fully charged, he would be a god, and my silence would be his eternal trophy. But the king had forgotten one thing. A siren's voice doesn't just command the living, it can shatter the ancient. I stepped toward the altar, ignoring the stinging energy that lashed out from the crown. I didn't care about the gods or the hunters anymore. I looked at Kaelen, seeing the man who had fought his way through the dead lands just to find me, and I felt the last of my restraints snap. I opened my mouth, and for the first time in 3 long years, I spoke. Break. The word wasn't a scream. It was a command that vibrated the very foundation of the palace. The sound hit the violet light like a hammer against glass. I watched as the siphon reversed, the dark energy exploding outward and throwing Valerius against the far wall. The true crown shattered into 1,000 pieces of harmless gold, and Kaelen slumped forward, the life force rushing back into his body in a sudden, violent wave. He was alive, and for the first time, the silence that had defined our lives was gone. Valerius scrambled to his feet, his face twisted in horror. He realized that the mute Luna was gone, replaced by a queen whose voice could dismantle his magic with a single breath. He tried to summon the Void Walkers, but as I spoke his name, the shadows refused to obey him. They turned, sensing a higher authority in the room. This wasn't a false victory. The king was alone, his traps were spent, and the woman he had tried to silence was now the one holding the gavel. Kaelen stood up, his strength returning as the last remnants of the violet energy dissipated into the air. He looked at me, not with fear of my power, but with a profound sense of awe. He realized that the woman he had spent a decade trying to protect was the very force that had just saved his soul. He didn't need to ask if I was okay. He could hear the resonance of my spirit in the air around us. Together, we turned to face Valerius, who was cowering against the altar, his hands clawing at the stone as if searching for one last secret passage. There were no more traps, no more illusions, and no more false victories. I stepped forward and spoke again, my voice ringing through the sanctum like a silver bell. I commanded the palace doors to open and the High Council to enter. As the elders filed into the room, they saw their tyrant, king reduced to a trembling shell, and the mute Luna standing as a pillar of light beside the true heir. I told them the truth, not just about the king's cruelty, but about the night my father died and the lie that had kept us all in chains. The High Council didn't need to deliberate. They saw the shattered crown and the restored prince, and they felt the authority in my voice that no curse could ever dampen. They stripped Valerius of his title on the spot, the Void Walkers vanishing into the ether as the blood bond was officially severed. Kaelen didn't take the throne with a sword. He took it with a nod of respect to the pack he had never truly stopped loving. He turned to me, and for the first time in front of the world, he named me as his true mate and the sovereign queen of the Shadow Crest. As the sun began to rise over the cliffs, the palace felt different, lighter, as if it had finally started to breathe again. Kaelen and I stood on the balcony, looking out over a kingdom that was no longer built on silence. He took my hand and promised that from this day forward, our pack would be a place where every voice was heard and every secret was brought into the light. The journey of the forgotten wolf and the mute Luna had ended, and the reign of the star-born king and the siren queen had just begun. If you believe that no one should ever be silenced, show your support by hitting that like button right now. We want to hear from you. What was the most shocking moment for you? Was it the reveal of Elara's hidden power or the king's final trap in the sanctum? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and tap that bell icon so you never miss a chapter of our epic wolf sagas. Before you go, don't forget to tell us where you're watching from, whether it's London, New York, or anywhere across the globe. We love seeing where our pack members are located. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.